Hello everyone. Thanks for watching and welcome to Oh sorry, wrong school. As I was saying, welcome to Homeroom. Here in this section, I will be updating you with the latest information and announcements from Merkabah Academy. So, when you log in, make sure you check here for any new updates, but if it's something urgent, the player will be set to autoplay, and the video will play soon as you log in. There are now more classes and games available. We are also still adding more to the Academy. Feel free to look around, starting with your new locker right here. Below is your new desk. There you will find new courses, course materials, and many other items right on top of your desk. Test grades and reports will also appear on your desk once you log in. When there is a new course, a notebook will appear. Just click on the item, and it will take you to the right place. Well, that's the bell. Have fun, people, and welcome to the Academy.
Hey everyone, here's one last chance to get Never Pay Again membership for only $24.99. And it comes with full Podia access and all digital downloads. Hurry, because this is only a 24-hour one-time offer that ends Monday. Make sure you take advantage, and see you at the Academy.
It's so much that the body does that deals with energy and consciousness that we are not aware of. We want to touch on a few of those things in this video. We're going to get into it a lot more in future videos. But when understanding the body and how it pertains to our energy and consciousness, we can then, in meditation, understand what we need to do to heal ourselves, to fix and repair ourselves, to boost our energy. And when you can actually do things. You can't do nothing without knowing how to do it. So you must understand, just the principles of how stuff works, the intricate workings and mechanisms of how the body moves, from your joints, your bones, your arteries, or what have you. Everything has a unique movement. Everything moves a certain way. Everything deals with something that's going to eventually come down to energy. And the only way it's going to function is because of energy, which we are energetic beings. So when I talked about in meditation about how, energy flows down the spine, and because of that, we can move. So when you understand, just how the body works, it really helps in meditation, going forward as far as, healing your body and everything like that. So once the ancients understood that everything came into existence because of consciousness and energy, they then had to understand that we, at our purest form, are consciousness and energy. We are the result of consciousness creating energy, energy creating matter. Now, how did this begin? Consciousness became aware of itself. How do we become aware? We focus, we concentrate. Meditation is how we use consciousness to affect the physical world. And our physical world would be our bodies. So understand, consciousness created everything that we see, everything that we physically experience. We are consciousness, but we forgot how to control our consciousness to affect our physical bodies and our physical world. Now, again, this is stuff that people find far-fetched because it sounds a little bit spooky. But again, this is stuff we have proven. You manipulate atoms all the time. I talked about this before in the video on YouTube about human energy and how you can manipulate atoms, by understanding that different materials have different amounts of attraction for electrons. And when you take two different materials and you rub it together, one material will steal electrons from the other, causing it to become positively charged while it remains negatively charged. And we know opposites attract. And this is how they do the balloon experiment, as I talked about, when you have the frizzy hair, when you can stick the balloon on a wall, because you cause the electrons in those atoms on the wall to move into a different position behind the atom, causing that area on the wall to become, negatively charged. So this is something that we can do on the smallest level, and understanding how to manipulate atoms. And this is something that is so powerful that we do with static, shock, static electricity, with just using our hands, using the electromagnetic field around us that our body, protrudes, and controlling electrons and controlling our physical world in small ways. So it's tough for people to kind of comprehend this, consciousness to energy, energy to matter, because it's tough to understand something seemingly coming from nothing at all. This is why I gave you the example, using sex, using sexual stimulation, about how the thought of sex can cause you to become aroused, man or woman. So the thought, it begins with a thought. You could be looking at something sexual and still become stimulated. So you have thought, which that thought is your consciousness. Consciousness then sends that energy to the hippocampus, down the fibers of the choroid plexus, to the fornix, down the spine, to the sacral nerve, and causes stimulation. So we can see again from thought, consciousness, we have something coming from, nothing, seemingly nothing, to create all of this stimulation. But we understand even still the stimulation or the consciousness that's going to create this energy is coming from what we're watching or reading or thinking about. So even just thoughts alone can cause this stimulation. It's something that's unbelievable, but it's the best way to break it down on a basic level to understand that something comes from nothing inside you all the time. Again, before you move, before you make any kind of movement, it happens so fast. There is a thought that is processed. And we have been, conditioned to do this really quick. And it's fluent. Our movement, we move and don't even realize that we're thinking about doing it before we actually do it, because the action is so fast, we can't even comprehend it, the speed consciously. So we move. So even, when I move my hands and everything, even when you do the same thing, there is a thought that you had in your brain telling you to do that, putting out the signal, the information to your body to do it before you do it. And it happens super speed. So it's amazing when you really get into it. The problem is, since we don't understand these little things, it has never been broken down to us in, such a way, even in school, we don't pick up on this stuff, because once you start picking up on it, you start getting deeper into what the body and consciousness and energy is all about. And this is something that they don't want to happen, of course. So let's take this a different route, a more complex route. Let's take this to creation itself. Because once you start to understand creation itself and how we came into existence, then you get to start to really get a grasp and understand consciousness, energy to matter. And you understand, one, consciousness to energy to these elements. We understand, one, everything is made up of atoms. There's no way around that. We can take it deeper and go into, quarks and string theory or what have you, but let's keep it simple. But when we understand that you have atoms, you have the energy creating these elements, creating atoms or what have you, and we understand that this goes back to our DNA. And our DNA has all those elements that consciousness creating energy creating the elements. These elements are within our DNA. So when we get into briefly about creation and understanding what DNA is and what it contains, when you start digging into this, there's no way you won't come to the same conclusion as me in understanding that, one, there is no way that we were an accident. We were just created out of thin air. That when you see how complex it is to create a human being, to create what we are, there's no way this is something that just happened accidentally. This is something that was a lot of conscious effort, a lot of conscious thought went into our creation. You understand what I mean, on a brief level. But when you understand DNA and the elements that it contains, we know we have carbon, we have hydrogen, we have oxygen, we have nitrogen, we have phosphorus. We have also within us, we have iron, we have calcium, we have copper, we have manganese, we have zinc, we have iodine. We have a lot of metals and non-metals within us, just like the planet itself. So you understand that these elements all have atomic numbers. And atomic numbers because they contain atoms. They are made up of atoms. So for example, you have the atomic number of 20. 20 gives us calcium. And 20 meaning that you talk about electrons, protons, and neutrons, atoms. So we have these electrons within these elements. That is the energetic part of them, understanding energy. But we have these atoms in everything. So when you understand, one, calcium makes up our bones. So when you go back again to consciousness, creating energy, energy creating these elements is going to form our DNA. Calcium, 20, the atomic number 20, that's our bone structure right there. So we can see how this goes. So in understanding that, you can understand it's impossible when you think about the many combinations that have to happen with atoms to create these elements to give us the human body. That would be like if we were an accident, we were just something that was created, accidentally or by coincidence. That would be like taking a bucket of Legos, put a bunch of Legos in a bucket, and then throwing the bucket of Legos in the air, and then they perfectly forming, the shape of a man. That's what people are saying if they believe we just came together as a result of, some kind of evolution or some kind of accident. It's bullshit. You got to pay attention and look at how complex this stuff is. And there's no way you can put a bunch of Legos in a bucket, throw it up in the air, and you just have a human shape, a body shape. Consciousness comes into play. So when you think about when your child takes Legos, when you take some Legos and you have to really consciously think about what you want to create first. You have a thought in your head and you go and you build it with the Legos. The same thing with us. You have to understand the Legos, the size, the shape, what fits where. It's the same thing with these elements. You have to understand what they do. You have to understand how many atoms is going to make this element. How many atoms is going to make this? How many atoms is going to make that? And once you have this complex understanding of once you do put these atoms together and you get these other elements, what do they do? How are they going to work? And then we're talking about complexity, serious complexity, and putting together a body, not just human body, but even animals and everything else. And when you start getting into DNA and how complex it is and the information that it holds, you see that this is something that is seriously impossible to just, throw together. So we know DNA is the chemical that carries our genetic code from one generation to the next. Our cells are created to basically house our DNA. Our cells are mostly made up of hydrogen and oxygen, 59% hydrogen, 24% oxygen, but it also contains carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and so on and so forth, other elements as well. So when you understand that we're talking about DNA that contains so many different elements, and why these elements may have different names, again, they are all made up of atoms, a whole bunch of atoms. And again, when you talk about you have to get so many different amounts of atoms to create these different elements. So we're talking about multiple combinations of atoms to give us these elements. So you can have, our DNA can contain billions of atoms within one cell. So we're talking about billions of atoms within one single cell. So when you think about billions of atoms, billions we're talking in one cell, and you think about how many cells we have in our body, this is why people say, we're made up of trillions of atoms. We're talking about a lot of energy, all of this coming into play because of consciousness creating this energy creating these elements that we're talking about when we're talking about hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen, phosphorus and everything like that. So when you start getting into this stuff, again, it's mind-boggling. It tells you, one, this is something that is complex. And we're talking about all of this energy, all of these atoms in one single cell. This is something that is seriously, complex and that has to be well thought up of. So we know that DNA is a nucleic acid. And nucleic acid is basically a nucleotide. We won't get into nucleotides too much. But there are two types of nucleic acids. We have DNA, we have RNA. Now, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, RNA, ribonucleic acid, they both have 4 smaller nucleic acids. So with DNA, you have adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine. Now, RNA has all of those as well, except for thymine. Instead of thymine, it has uracil. So we're talking about DNA, RNA, these genetic codes containing all this information that's basically going to make up our human structure, our human bodies. and all the cells and organs or what have you, when you put a combination of many different atoms coming together to give us these elements. So when you think about our bone structure, I talked about with calcium, think about our organs and everything like that. We're talking about different combinations of atoms, elements coming together to give us this structure. So now again, DNA contains the genetic code that's going to allow you to transfer information from one generation to another. But understand, DNA cannot, inside of the nucleus, from inside the nucleus, transfer that information out. So basically, when the DNA is inside of the nucleus, it's basically locked into the cell. It can't transfer that information out. This is where RNA comes in. And there's 3 types of RNA. You have messenger RNA, you have ribosomal RNA, which is rRNA, and ribosomal RNA basically gets the information from the messenger DNA and basically decodes it. And then you have transfer DNA, which is going to transfer that transfer RNA, which is going to transfer that message into proteins and basically continue to create the process, create the structure. So you have the RNA go into the nucleus of the cell, basically copy the DNA because it leaves the DNA intact inside the cell. It doesn't take the whole genetic code out because, it'll collapse. But it takes the information from the nucleus of the cell, the DNA, makes a copy of it, then comes out of the nucleus and then goes on ahead, process it, and then goes on ahead to continue to spread out the information to create, who you will become. Because everything that you are is locked within that DNA. Everything. So you have the combination of your parents coming together and creating this new DNA. Everything we're talking about from all time, from both of your creations is locked in there. And we know when the person is born, they have different traits from different parents, or they can have traits from their uncle. You can do stuff your uncle used to do, your grandma used to do. You can look like your grandma, look like your uncle. I look more like my uncle. I don't even look like my dad that much. I can see my dad a little bit. I look like my uncle. I had to ask my mom at some point, like, yeah, you sure it's something that you don't want to tell me? Like, it's weird when you understand how complex it is. But it gets you into their whole understanding and realization that this is something that is complex. I went through all of this with DNA. We can go into a lot deeper, but I don't like getting into all this information because it gets confusion after a while. But I went into this information so you can understand how complex it is. So you take this information and think about how the RNA goes in there and basically takes the genetic code to continue to process, to begin to make up the rest of you. Because remember, once that melanin explosion happened and, conception is done and over with and, a child is going to be born, it's not completely intact. That's something we'll touch on later. But you have to understand that it's a lot of work that happens from that point. And it's a lot that is done. And the fact that this is seemingly this automatic process that's in our DNA, that once it's there and the process starts to happen, you have at work energy creating us, energy creating animals, energy creating planets, all these elements unraveling from energy because of consciousness. This is something that has to be consciously thought of in order for it to happen. And this is really deep that we're going to touch into because you have to really think about what I just said. This is something that consciously had to be thought of, in order to bring this stuff into existence. By no means could this be an accident when you think about that type of complexity. Perfect analogy. Putting Legos into a trash can, throw it up in the air. If a human being comes down, I'm wrong. So now, when you look at all of the metals and non-metals that we are made up of, I talked about before how we have iron and copper and manganese and zinc, iodine, all these metals within us. You also find these metals within the planet itself. So when I talked about before how our planet was created as a result of a supernova. So you have to understand the last element to be produced before a supernova happens, before that major explosion happens, the last element to be produced is iron. Iron is produced. So you have the majority of the core of the earth is formed by iron. And we find it everywhere. We find all these elements throughout the planet. And I talked about Dr. Manhattan from the movie The Watchmen, from the comic book, I should say, Watchmen. Now, Mr. Manhattan, Dr. Manhattan, basically, he had his body, he had his flesh basically destroyed. He was converted into pure energy. And because he knew, he understood how the body is constructed, he was able to pull himself together. But he was first, basically converted into energy. Energy is seen and unseen. We'll talk about that a little bit here. And this is something the ancient Egyptians talked about. But he was converted into pure energy because he had this knowledge. He could pull himself, back together. Now, the symbol that he took, that he put on his forehead, is a symbol of the hydrogen atom. And that's amazing that he took that symbol, but it's trying to tell you something that he took, the hydrogen atom. Now, I talked about this before in a previous DVD about how when you look at the periodic tables, all the periodic tables of elements, all the elements contain hydrogen atoms. They are basically hydrogen atoms, different amounts of hydrogen atoms. When I say hydrogen atoms, I'm talking about atoms. The same thing I said before about how atoms make up all these elements is the same. Hydrogen atoms. So he took the symbol of the hydrogen atom, which we can go back and look at that symbol in ancient times. It also can represent the sun. It also can represent Saturn. So everything that they're trying to show you in that movie, The Watchmen, which we'll talk about a little bit more in this video because it has a lot in it. Everything they're trying to show you in that movie, in The Watchmen, about Dr. Manhattan, they are expressing what we are in essence and what we could do if we control our energy and consciousness, which would be in essence controlling our hydrogen atoms and being able to do some amazing stuff. You've seen what he can do in that movie, and you have to think about that. Again, this is stuff that seems far-fetched and far off, but when you understand what we're talking about and how real this stuff is and how these people know, how they make experiments and how they do things to basically manipulate these atoms to do outrageous, crazy stuff, you can begin to think of the possibilities that, we can come up with just understanding at the basic level. We are energy, we are consciousness, but the fact that in our DNA carries the genetic code for who and what we are. And by accessing that, we can basically recreate ourselves, cloning as such. We can basically heal ourselves and do amazing things by understanding how to access that DNA. Now imagine if you can access that DNA consciously, and consciously control what happens as far as your RNA going into that cell and pulling out that information, then what you can do with that information. Think about then breaking that down on an energetic level and doing something else with it. So when you go back to the movie, he made multiples of himself. I mean, this is basically what it's talking about. This is something that is like possible. I know it sounds crazy, but it's possible if you think about what you can do, if you control this stuff. It's just possible. And when they get into the X-Men and when they get into all these Marvel superheroes, especially the ones that have to deal with elements, this is what they're talking about. Because this is stuff that just can't be ignored. This is stuff that's possible. And if you get into the physical world, the physics world, I should say, this whole scientific world, and you really start studying, it's almost scary. Because then you think about, what can these people do? What have they discovered? What have they created? They have to have some amazing stuff by now, knowing what they know, for hundreds of years. These are things we got to take into consideration. So we have to understand that they are telling us that our solar system, the planets, are a result of an accident, of a big bang. So we got to go deeper into that whole thing and understand the process of a supernova and what happens and why it happens and is it supposed to happen. This is something that they don't really touch on too much. They give us the process and what happened, what causes a star to explode, but we can't look at that and just say it's a coincidence. There has to be more deeper reasoning behind that. So they tell us that, Earth is unique. that there is nothing like Earth. It's unique. If it was 1 degree higher or lower, everybody would be dead. No life could survive on this place. But you have to look at that and understand that they're telling us that because they want us to think that this, Earth is a coincidence, that it just came up out of nowhere. It's a coincidence that we are here and everything here is a coincidence. It's by chance. And this is something that when you understand how complex things are, you simply can't accept, being an intelligent person. But you also have to look at the fact that one, the moon perfectly aligns with the sun to give us, the eclipse. Can't be a coincidence. You have to look at the fact that one, if Jupiter wasn't in the position that it's in right now, basically blocking the asteroid belt, we'd probably been, wiped out a long time ago by, meteors or comets or asteroids or what have you. But Jupiter blocks all of that traffic for us. So we can't think about planets, we can't think about atoms and think about this stuff as being an accident. It's deeper. So, this is where it gets really deep, it gets really crazy when you start thinking along the lines of a lot of different subjects, a lot of different things. So it gets deep. Now, as I said, consciousness needs existence. Consciousness needs something to perceive in order to expand. Plain and simple. Now, you can't have nothing, absolutely nothing, and try to expand consciousness because consciousness has nothing to perceive in order to grow. Now, again, as I said, when consciousness became aware of itself being something, it can move. Existence being something, it can move, it can begin to grow. This is like going really, really deep into it when you really think about it. The beginning, consciousness, becoming aware, consciousness perceiving itself. So without perception, there is no reality. There is nothing that can happen. You need something to perceive. You need to be able to perceive. So you have to think about it. You can't just, if you never learned Chinese, you can't just all of a sudden wake up and start speaking Chinese. It had to be something there, some kind of class you took, something for you to just all of a sudden start speaking Chinese. There was a man that woke up and could speak Spanish. A lot of y'all probably seen that story. But then when you follow his genetic code, his DNA, it goes back that far. So Spanish is just built into his DNA a long time ago. Whatever happened to him, it got decoded and he can speak it. This is something that I heard about before, that when you tap into those genetic codes, you should be able to basically replicate what your ancestors did. This is what it goes into in Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed, remember, they're using the Animus, the machine. I touched on this before in the Morris DVD, to basically go back into this person's DNA where all of the information that everybody in his line, his entire line, has basically done something. All that information is within his DNA. And they're using the machine called the Animus to basically tap into all of that and go back and see what he did and formalize what his ancestors did. That's amazing. Again, they give it to you in movies what's possible, what they can do. But think about that when you look at it on a sense of DNA and the sense of cells and electrons and atoms and what we know our DNA contains as far as information. If it's talking about, generation to generation, we know we can find it in DNA. So we have to look at this type of stuff. But for most of us, you can't just, teach your son about trigonometry if you never learned it yourself. You will be clueless. All of us remember being a kid, being in elementary school, being in the classroom, and then your teacher goes to the chalkboard and she write this crazy division problem on the chalkboard or this crazy math problem on the chalkboard, and you're looking at it like, oh my God, what is this? Chalkboard might as well be blank because you have no clue what it is or how to solve it. So over time, as you are taught, as you learn, you begin to understand how to do the math problem. You begin to learn how to solve it. And, you study. And what do people tell you when you study? Concentrate, focus. But in essence, what are you really doing as it pertains to school, as it pertains to learning? What are you doing? You are memorizing. You're memorizing. You're not learning anything new. You're memorizing what has already existed. So the formula the process, the steps of solving math problems has already been thought of. It has already been thought of. It has already been done and put out there. All you have to do is memorize it. You have to memorize it. Once you memorize the process, memorize the steps and the rules, you can go ahead and do the problem. Now, as a result of you memorizing these steps, you can solve the problem. You can now do math. You are now smarter, as we would say. So we go ahead and we look at the process of school, the process of schooling, the process of education. And it's not so much learning, it's memorizing. All of this stuff existed already. You are memorizing what has already been solved. We get textbooks in school. You know, when you get a history book, history has happened already. You are memorizing the events that took place.